Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Since leaving the police, I've been looking at things slightly differently. When I was a cop, my job was to catch the bad guys. I didn't really have time to think about what was going to happen after they were convicted. I just moved on to the next case. However, since leaving the police, I've had time to look closer at the effects of imprisonment, and I have to say it's opened my eyes. It got me wondering, have we got it right with our justice system and prisons? Speaking to people about this subject, one name kept coming up. It was usually in the form of, you should speak to such and such. She's doing a lot of work around justice reform. That led me to catching up with today's guest on a number of occasions to talk about a range of things, including justice reform. I was blown away by her passion and genuine desire to help people caught up in the justice system and make the world a better place. Today's guest is the Executive Director of the recently formed Justice Reform Initiative. Their aim is to reform the way the nation deals with the disadvantaged and crime, so it's no longer overly reliant on incarceration. That is a huge task, but if anyone's up to the challenge, I reckon it's today's guest, Dr. Mindy Sotiri. Mindy Sotiri, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here.
Well, it's good to see you, Mindy. But I think last time we saw each other, it was at Government House.
It was at a very fancy sort of event.
Very fancy.
Lots of interesting people there.
Yeah. I don't know how you got me an invite there, but
I've got connections.
you must have connections.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was sort of one of those things where we're doing it in every state and territory, actually, where the Justice Reform Initiative is having some sort of reception to just, I guess, acknowledge that we're trying to do some work in this space. So you would have probably seen at Government House, we had public prosecutors, we've got former members of parliament, we've got lots of service delivery providers, people with lived experience of incarceration, lots of people coming together, I guess, with the same sort of message.
It really interests me, the people from all different areas you've just outlined, but all agreeing that something's got to give. We've got to change something, and that was heartening that you got that. It wasn't, because quite often on law and order issues, it's one group pushing against the other, and let's get tough on crime, and no one wants to have the genuine conversation. Can we do it a little bit better?
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the things that I'm really interested in is all of the different people with very different backgrounds, often quite different values in terms of what's right and what's wrong, but everybody for different reasons agreeing that the way that we're doing things at the moment, especially in terms of prisons and over-imprisoning people, is just not a smart way to go.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because I've been thinking about it, people identify with me being the cop, so, okay, you do the crime, you do the time, but the type of stuff that you're talking about, and I've talked with you and people we met at that function, if we can prevent crime and reduce crime and recidivism and everything else that comes with it, it has to benefit everyone.
Yeah, it's about a sort of a smarter way of trying to do community safety, I guess. And I think it is really, and I'm really interested also in kind of policing perspectives on this, because I think often we think about police as being in one camp.
Yeah.
And having a particular objective. But, we've got former police commissioners as part of our patron base, and we're certainly interested in different ways that we can kind of engage police and engage community in doing things differently. And there's a stack of examples, I guess, that I've been pretty inspired by overseas in terms of different ways of approaching policing.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit later. I'm interested in what's happening over in the Netherlands, and as a good point of reference to sort of balance it out. But do you struggle getting that message across with the law and order? Because I know if there's a crime that offends society or whatever, the push is, the word on the street, the general public is, they should throw away the key, we should do this, we should do that. I'll put it out there. There are some crimes that, some people that just can't be fixed, but the majority of people, if you treat them like animals or don't prepare them to come out of jail, when they do come out, we all suffer.
I think that's absolutely right. And I guess that regardless of what your feelings are about what should happen to people who commit crime, there's got to be a kind of pragmatism to the way that we think about what should then happen once they have gone to prison.
Yeah.
If we're going to use prisons in the way that we are, what I guess a lot of people don't really recognise is that, about 98% of people that go to prison come out of prison. So there's very few people that we put in prison for the rest of their lives, for an actual life sentence. And so I guess that what we also, and what, one of the great joys of my job is talking to lots of people, including people that don't necessarily have a lot of information about the justice system. And, people are very surprised when they learn, a third of people are on remand. They haven't even been found guilty of anything. They're just waiting for their prison sentence. So that's a third of the 43,000 people that we've got locked up in Australia. And then when people also learn that the vast majority of people are in for actual sentences of less than 2 years, so they're actually cycling in and out, not doing particularly long sentences. But then even with people that have done more serious crimes and that are in there for longer, when people learn that often people are not prepared for release, that 50% of people come out homeless, that, 70% of people haven't had access to drug and alcohol treatment when they need it, all of that stuff.
Just on that, and I only learnt this, and I'm embarrassed by my ignorance, but it was a guest that we had on the podcast, Ali Colquitt, and she was saying that on remand you don't get access to drug programs and all sorts of things, and the majority of people are on remand, or there's a large portion on remand, so they got access to no training or education within that system to help them overcome probably what got them in there in the first place.
Yeah, it's a pretty and that's exactly it. There's almost nothing when you're on remand, and they're tough jails because everyone's really nervous and waiting for their court dates and waiting to find out, what the outcome of their sort of court appearance is going to be. So they're tough places. They're all maximum security as well. Yeah. So they're
because you got all the mix of
exactly,
different types of offence.
And no access to programs inside. So that's that again, it's sort of, when I sort of think about what some of those alternatives might be for people that have come into contact with police, especially, there's lots of people that are there because they've done the same thing again and again and again, not necessarily increasing in severity, just the same stupid
nothing's
stuff.
Changing.
Nothing's changing in their lives. Nothing's changing in terms of drug addiction. Nothing's changing in terms of poverty. Nothing's changing in terms of how much police are kind of, surveilling. Yeah. So all of these things stay the same. They're just coming back and nothing's changing. I kind of think it's a little bit heartbreaking that we don't have those kinds of circuit breakers in place, because, we've got this very ambitious target at the Justice Reform Initiative to reduce the numbers of people in prison by 50% over the next 10 years. But I kind of think, well, if we actually were to build a different kind of system, even just for that third of people that are cycling in and out on remand, we'd be close to changing
the system. Things. It's not working the way it should be working. It's not achieving what we're hoping to achieve with the jails. I look back and it has improved since these days, but it really resonated with me. Bernie Matthews, who I know was well known to you, and he was a good friend of mine before he passed away. And it was sad when he passed away. He spent a lot of time in prison, a lot of time in the violent prisons, and he made a comment to me, and he was talking about the group of prisoners that were known as the Intractables up in Grafton, and the violence that created by their violence was inflicted on them. And I'm not saying that's occurring now, but the effect, if you treat people a certain way, they're going to react a certain way, and you're going to get something that comes out of the system, angry, cranky, and violent. What's your take on that?
I think there have been shifts in terms of the way that we lock people up, but there's no doubt that prisons are still really brutal, dehumanising places. We call people by their numbers often rather than their names. People have to wear a particular uniform. And I know that people will see that as, part of the punishment. But I guess that, again, just really pragmatically, what if you sort of, I often think about it like this. If somebody were to always treat me sort of in relation to the worst horrible things that I've done, like say I was really shitty.
You're allowed to swear.
But say I was a really horrible teenager, or say, we've all done stuff that we're not proud of.
If you keep getting slapped down, you're going to bite back.
Exactly. But also you're going to start seeing yourself the way that other people do. We're social creatures. So if your sort of formative years, say a lot of kids that, end up in youth prison, if your years are sort of spent with people telling you or saying to you,
you're worthless,
and you've got to address your offending behaviour, and you deserve to be punished, and you're developmenting, you're still developing, and you're still still figuring out who you are, and if that then continues on into your adult life, and then if your whole sort of social network becomes around who you spend time with in prison. And there's no circuit breakers. Nobody's coming in and going, hey, how about, we actually really sit down with you and figure out what needs to happen so that you're not doing this stuff. And that is unfortunately the case for most people. No one's coming in and going.
The cycle keeps repeating itself.
It just keeps repeating. And of course, that identity as somebody who, maybe is good at crime, maybe is good at being in prison, and maybe, has a reputation around that. That's really, if you don't have something else, we all stick with what we know and what we're comfortable with.
And if you're recognised for your skills or you're respected in that environment. We've got ahead of ourselves.
Yep.
I've got to find out where the passion came from. So to find out where the passion for this social justice, tell us about yourself.
I feel like I am so boring compared to most of the guests that I know that you have on this show. I was listening to some of the podcasts going, my story is nowhere near as interesting or as inspiring.
Don't you worry. 90% of the time I walk out of here, I feel like, what have I done? But tell us your story.
Look, I got interested in this I had a sort of social justice kind of bent as a young person, as a teenager, and I went to university to do social work. I thought that might be a good sort of outlet for it. And so there were a couple of things, I guess, that happened during that period. I had a couple of amazing mentors and teachers that were passionate about criminal justice. And so Professor Tony Vincent was one of those.
Right. And what was the thing that was excited you about what he was pushing?
It's strange because I don't know. I didn't know until I'd started working in the prisons what it actually was, but I was hooked by what he was saying. I was really troubled by what I was learning around who it was that went to prison in Australia. I guess it hadn't been something that I'd really thought very much about. I'd not had exposure to the prison system in Australia myself or in New Zealand where I grew up, so it wasn't like I grew up with it. But when I started learning about who went to prison, what happened to people when they went to prison, the sort of Nagel Royal Commission and the Bathurst riots and sort of this history of kind of violence and this really adversarial relationship between people in prison and prison officers. And I guess I was fascinated by it. And then I ended up doing a couple of placements, student placements. One of my first ones was at Long Bay.
Was that confronting? How old were you at that?
Yeah, I was. I guess I was 20, maybe 21, and I think the thing that really struck me when I first went into the men's prison at Long Bay, and then very soon after that out to Mullewa, or Silverwater, the women's prison. I remember just being struck by the fact that the people in there were my age to start with, so heaps of young people in there.
That's interesting because if you haven't been exposed to that, and most people aren't. Like I was because of my policing. You were because of your work. But most people don't get to see what's inside there.
No.
And so it's just a foreign thing. It's what you might see on snippets from TV. But other than that, it's a strange world.
And then I guess because I was sort of doing this, I was doing project work where I was working with people on putting together little booklets and things like that. So I was getting to know people that were in prison. So
some
prisoners.
Of the prisoners,
And again, I was just sort of really struck by, I guess, everything that I'd learnt about imprisonment from TV shows and from the media just didn't feel like what it actually felt like to be sitting in a room with someone, sharing a cup of tea. I smoked at the time, so lots of sharing cigarettes and just talking to people about their lives. And again, that sort of thing of this doesn't feel like the scary people that I've been taught that I should be
There's a
afraid
humanity to them that most people, if you look, you see the prisoner in the greens or whatever they're wearing and you think a prisoner and you don't even open your mind up to what's behind that.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of, I ended up doing that work for years and getting to know people, quite well and really realising. And then I guess the other thing that sort of came into play with me, and I guess that's what's really kept me hooked and kept me, I guess, wanting to change the way that we imprison, is because I realised, my own background, and again, it's sort of, my it's very different from some of the backgrounds I know from some of the people that have been on the podcast. It's sort of this intergenerational thing. But so my grandmother, who I was very close to, she was a Holocaust survivor. So she'd been through many different concentration camps and, had been through Auschwitz and had a tattoo on her wrist. And
it's incredible.
Yeah. But she was an amazing, incredible, lighthearted, joyous sort of woman. But I guess that I grew up because of her experience and because, almost all of her family died. So almost all of my family died. So on my mother's side of the family, there was her and, a couple of sort of cousins and then my mum. But I guess that I knew on a very fundamental level that really bad things can happen to people, including incarceration, including all sorts of different kinds of punishment and brutality, not because they're bad people, but because of the circumstances.
Well, that's
the circumstances in which they're born.
Like Holocaust victims, nothing that they did.
That's right. But and then I guess I started really. I mean, it's a dotted line. It's not a straight line. Started thinking about, well, most of the people that we actually lock up in prison, had they been born, had they happened to be born in a different set of circumstances, they wouldn't be in prison. Had I happened to be born in a different set of circumstances into a community, for instance, where there were no resources, there was no education or, no sort of encouragement for education, no resources to services, no, constant policing, so constant, and where if anything is going wrong for you as a kid, say you're sort of a victim of a crime or you've got an intellectual disability, rather than support services kind of wrapping themselves around you and parents and families being great advocates because there's not the capacity, often you end up in contact with the police. So the police end up being your sort of, the first time that you receive, say, an intellectual disability diagnosis. So sorry, that's a roundabout way of saying it's really around that recognition that it's not an us and them situation. Any of us, had we been born.
I think anyone, if you do get exposed to that and you're open-minded enough not to just draw a line in the sand and say they're the good guys, we're the bad guys, or vice versa, if you break that down a little bit, there are people in there and people go, like sometimes they'll ask me, what's the worst criminal you've put away? Some people I've sent to jail I've liked. They've made a mistake, quite often a very big mistake. That's why they're in jail. But I can almost see how it happened or why it happened, and trying not to judge them. I take it with the impact it must have from your family, with your grandmother and all that. If someone's persecuted just because who they are and what you've described, socially disadvantaged or lower economic part, they are disadvantaged and they do just tend to go that path. Indigenous, and I want to talk about that specifically, but we'll just touch on it. The high incarceration rate of Indigenous community compared to statistically. And it's because of those circumstances. I've sat here with some guests that have grown up in Indigenous communities and I've seen it. They don't have the services. They don't have the support. So when a problem comes in, the police come in, they start getting a police record that gets bigger and bigger, and it could be just for minor little things because there's no way to break it. And then all of a sudden, this person's no hope, we're going to send them to jail, and then it just continues on. Is that the type of thing you're talking about? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that sort of, and you can absolutely see it in Indigenous communities. And I know you've had some amazing guests and I see it all the time. I should say that, I guess it's Aboriginal leaders that have actually been doing most of the heavy lifting with most of this work around advocacy, around incarceration, because those communities have really borne the brunt of it and suffered as a consequence because of it. I think that I was just, when you were talking about that idea that, you've put some people away where you've kind of gone, he's, kind of like him, but he's done this terrible thing. One of the other things just that my family really instilled in me, and again, was my grandmother. She was very funny. She used to make a lot of jokes about the Holocaust, which I know you can't, it's not my place.
She's allowed to.
She was allowed to.
Yeah.
But one of the things that she often used to say is, darling, some of the Nazis, they were not so bad really. And, and that's me doing a really bad Polish accent, by the way. But she, but this idea that even, the people that should have been her absolute enemy. She sort of saw in them that, you know, there was good in them, and they were also, you know, a product of their circumstance. So I think that thing of going, you know, I'm incredibly lucky in terms, I know I'm incredibly lucky in terms of the circumstances in which I was born into, but I also know that is just a matter of luck. That's not because of any quality that I happen to have.
I think with someone like your grandmother, and I've seen it with people on the show here, or people that have had really difficult experiences, they've got a more Zen-like attitude to life.
Yeah.
They don't stress on the little things, and it's like she could destroy herself by hate for the Nazis and just be bitter her whole life. But it sounds like she chose to live a life a different way. Yeah,
she really did. She really did. And I guess that, you know, she didn't, I think she cracked a lot of jokes about the Holocaust because she didn't want to sort of expose us to what the reality had been. So it was quite tricky trying to actually get the stories, but again, her story to either guard or to share as she wanted. But I guess that certainly I've observed that in different, you know, I see it in advocates who are sort of really enraged, and I see it in, you know, and I can understand why you would go that way. But yeah, for me personally, that sort of, I guess just knowing that we're all really complicated and we're all really flawed, and that, you know, that none of us are better than anybody else. Like all of this kind of, it sounds a bit cliche, but that's the stuff that I guess I try to bring to this work. And that's why I want to, you know, I want to build a different kind of system.
Do you think your exposure in the prisons at an early age where you're sort of forming your views and all that led you down that path? Is that because you saw, that these aren't just the animals behind the cage, these are actually people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't stop thinking about them. You know, it's a strange thing when you visit prisons, and I still think about this all the time. I don't go into prisons very much at all these days, but when I used to be in and out all the time, I remember every time I'd walk out of a prison, and you were probably in and out of them all the time as well, but every time I drove out of a car park, or, you know, out of Long Bay or Silverwater or wherever it was, I'd just have this sense of, you know, thank God I get to drive out of here.
It's interesting you say that, because I don't think people can fully appreciate how oppressive it is when you walk in there, and you walk in there and you know you're coming out in an hour or whatever. But when those gates are shut behind you, you feel insecure to start with. You feel like you're trapped. So,
that's right. And
it's oppressive, isn't it?
It's oppressive. And I guess that I just, you know, that sense of relief, and I guess when I was really young, just, you know, I used to walk away feeling very concerned about the people that, you know, I'd had these sort of conversations with, and people share their lives with you. And you know, when you're just sort of starting out as a social worker, you know, I was trying to do everything to kind of make things better, and you know, hopefully I would still be doing that if I was working as a social worker. But it stays with you, that stuff, and that sort of sense of the injustice that a lot of people would. So not just are they locked up, so that's, you know, whatever you think about, you know, whether or not we should have prisons or how much we should have prisons, you know, the reality is we've got people locked up. But then I guess I started understanding all of the other sort of punishments on top of the loss of liberty that people were actually experiencing. And those are the things we can actually change. So that's, I guess, where I started thinking we've got to do something different.
So where did you go to from there after a couple of few years in the prisons as a social worker?
Yeah, so that was, I did all those student placements, and then I actually got a job as a caseworker at the Community Restorative Centre, working with people leaving prison. I did a few different jobs there. For about the first 10 years was primarily casework related. So
can you explain to people what that is?
Yeah, so the Community Restorative Centre, or CRC, is a really long-standing community-based organisation that provides support. It's like a charity that provides support to people coming out of prison, and also provides support to their families. So families, and one of my early jobs at CRC was also working with families of prisoners and supporting them through their loved ones' incarceration. But the transitional or post-release work, which I was doing, is actually very similar to the work that CRC still does a lot of. And that's working with people sort of towards the end of their sentence. So, you know, 3 months sort of prior to them coming out of prison, working quite intensively on building a bit of a plan for what people are going to do when they come out of prison. and then working very intensively. So driving to prison on the day, the prison that they're at on the day of their release, picking them up, driving them to, there's millions of appointments. So people come out of prison, they've got to see parole, they've got to get to housing, they've got to get to Centrelink, they've got to...
and you know how quickly the world can pass you by if you're not keeping up with technology. And
oh, yeah.
Imagine tucked away for a couple of years and coming out and, you need to scan this and do that. It's...
all of that stuff. So, I mean, things like, people are really, it's so funny. I mean, it's not funny, it's heartbreaking, but, people are often really scared of getting on public transport when they first come out of prison. So there's all the really practical stuff around, how do you...
I just on that, the practical stuff, I looked at the website for the CRC and there is practical stuff. What happens when you go to prison? What happens in prison? How to survive in prison? I'd encourage people to have a look at it because it really breaks it down.
Yeah.
How intimidating it is.
Yeah, and how much you've got to learn. Like, it's a whole new world.
I think, so you get arrested, you go to prison. What if you've got a house and you've got animals at home? Who's going to feed the animal? Like, just little things like that. And it really brought it home to me looking on the website. So that's the type of thing that...
Yeah, all of that really practical stuff. But also, I guess that, prisons, again, like I know that I can imagine people thinking, oh, well, they've done something bad, so they deserve to be punished. But regardless, it changes people. The experience of prison changes people. And it's often quite traumatic, and people witness traumatic sort of things when they're in prison. And also people often leave prison really feeling like everybody can see that they've been in custody, and that doesn't really, it doesn't even matter if you've got prison tats or, anything like that. There's just often quite a strong sense of shame that people have, and that they won't be sort of accepted by the rest of the community. So things like getting on public transport, there's the sort of, there's the kind of technical stuff around Opal cards or however, or Metro cards or whatever it is that we've got. But there's also just that fear of stepping onto something where other people maybe are looking at you and maybe are able to somehow tell that you've been in prison.
And I was speaking to a prisoner when he was released, and he said, I still have my prison attitude. And I was asking, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, you had to be alert. If someone had a go at you, you had to stand up. And he said, when I got out, it was almost like I felt I was in prison. Someone would say something to me and I thought, well, I've got to back up here. I can't let him get away with that, or I'm going to be... And he realised that, no, that's not the way you live in society out of prison. So, I can imagine how difficult it would be.
It's really hard. So a lot of the stuff, like that casework stuff, it's all done in the community. So there's no sort of appointments or anything like that. You drive around with people a lot, and often, especially with men, they're much more inclined to talk when you're driving rather than sort of sitting down doing a face-to-face.
I don't want to talk about too much.
No, you're doing fine.
Let's not talk about emotions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but, and I think also you build up that trust sort of through just helping people out with really, complicated things around Centrelink, complicated things around housing. Often people are homeless, so navigating that system. But also it is that thing where a lot of people still have that, they know how to be in prison. Yeah. So going to coffee shops and talking to people, just having a chat about other things, like not necessarily to do with, deep stuff around how they're going in their lives, but just like chatting. And also when things do come up, like if a barista's really rude or something, like
overreact.
Yeah, that's right. So, and just sort of going, this isn't actually personal, trying to encourage people to know that they don't have to have their guard up all the time.
Because that fear, like the fear of going into prison, the fear of coming out to prison, I can imagine some people going, it's just all too hard. Like, I've got to get a job, I've got to enroll here, I've got to get here. Why don't I go into prison? They'll wake me up. I've still got the boys back in there. We can have a chat and whinge about how bad it is in prison, but they don't have to think type of thing. So not prepared for life outside the prison.
Totally. And again, it's like I'd be terrified to go into prison. So I'm still very, very scared of that, but because I know how much I would have to learn and how much I would have to adjust.
I think anyone, if they're honest and, tough guys, it doesn't worry me. Bullshit. Yeah. People don't want to go into prison.
No one wants to go into prison, but people get really used to it and they do become really accustomed to it. So it's that thing often where, especially you see a lot with younger guys coming out, where they're saying, look, I don't want to go back in there and I want to do different things. But life on the outside is really difficult.
Yeah.
It shouldn't actually have to be. Like, I guess that's one of the things that, I really realised at CRC, because you're doing the same thing again and again, different humans and different stories, but it's all housing, no money, difficulty getting employment, if lots of women coming out and navigating, trying to get custody of their kids back, like hard stuff, lots of appointments, often really tricky relationships with parole, often kind of medical and health issues, mental health issues. Like there's so much that it's quite easy to fail.
We were speaking to Simon Fennick, and he from Melbourne, and he did time in prison and got out, and he started working for an organisation called Fruit to Work. And he said something that sort of really opened my mind up to, you get out of prison and people expect you, okay, you've done your time now, start paying your debt to society, get a job, do this, do that. And he pointed out how difficult it was, just in simple things, that you haven't got a CV. It's like, where have you been? You've been in prison to start with. And then, I can get full-time employment, but I've got to see my parole officer every second Tuesday, and I've got to get drug tested on Thursday. And he's just these difficult things, just getting back into the normal society.
Yeah, and often people do end up really sort of getting set up to fail. Like I remember working with one guy who had to sort of report to his parole every day. And he had a particular limit in terms of like he couldn't go into particular geographic areas as part of his parole conditions. Housing, we're trying to get him a place and he had to go and look at a number of different houses as part of the process of getting a house in New South Wales is really complicated, and you have to, at that stage you had to physically go and look at a number of potential properties, even if you knew you couldn't live there because your parole conditions wouldn't allow it. So, but his situation, I remember him calling me in a panic because he couldn't get through to his parole officer, and he had to go and look at this property, which he knew he wouldn't be able to live in because it was outside of the geographic region. He wasn't even supposed to travel to that region, but housing had said, if you don't go and look at this house, you're off the list.
Right.
So
he's in a conundrum.
He doesn't know what to do, and trying to find the actual humans that are going to help you out in those situations when it's big, busy, overworked government kind of organisations is really tricky.
No one's going to take their time. Oh, right, now I understand. Yeah, okay, of course we can do this. It just doesn't happen, does it?
Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess that I used to, that when I worked at CRC, and CRC is still doing all this amazing work, but they work with maybe, 500, 600 people a year at max, coming out of prison. And there's about 20,000 people coming out of prison in New South Wales. And I just, and the demand for those services.
Is that because that's all they can cope with, or is that
how? Right. Yeah, that's all they're sort of funded to do. And so, a lot of organisations like CRC, they won't keep wait lists because it just sets people up to be too hopeful. If they happen to come out at a time that there happens to be a place on a program, then that's great. But often there's just not a place. And same with beds, most people, there's about 50% of people that are homeless when they come out.
So, they open the prison gates. Okay, your sentence is finished. You got because quite often people lose contact with people from the outside when they're inside. So the door's open. What do they do?
Well, if they don't have any support set up and they don't have like a worker, like a CRC person or somebody and nowhere to live, often it really is a matter of like, I don't know what the bags are now, but when I was working, it was like literally a rubbish bag full of your belongings. Often the belongings, like your clothes from when you went into custody, don't fit. Like often, people they put on a bit of weight when they go into prison. So often they've got these clothes that maybe they were wearing at court that don't fit.
And the flares don't cut it anymore.
That's right. They might have like half a Centrelink check kind of in their bank account, so like $270, and then they have to kind of apply for another advance payment. And they often will have like a sort of bus fare to get back to wherever it was that they sort of needed to get to, but not always. So you'll see, sometimes you can see around some of those regional prisons, which are miles away from train stations or public transport, you'll see people walking in their prison greens with a bag towards the train station. I still occasionally see people on trains that have clearly come out from prison. Yeah. So often what people end up doing is going to people that they do know and couch surfing often is the only thing that people can do.
And sadly, the reality is quite often they're the people that they're involved with that got them into trouble in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that thing, I mean, again, we're all social creatures and we all need to be around others. So the loneliness that people describe, like I've spoken to lots of people that, I'd work with at CRC who would be like, where were you when, 20 years ago when I was coming out of prison, or where was something? So people, gravitate towards finding a community. And for a lot of people that have been to prison, they might try like a hostel or a crisis shelter and stuff. I've heard stories of people just staying in their room in, whatever shelter or crisis place they're in because they're too scared to go out because they don't want to use, and they know that if they go out, that's what's going to happen. It's really hard. The amazing thing is that people do make changes and with nothing, without support. So, it's not to say you have to have a caseworker there.
So you do see, like we're talking the way that people could end up back in jail, but you do see the success stories in the time that you've been involved with the CRC.
Oh,
tell us about some of those where people have broken the cycles.
And look, there's no greater privilege, I think, than sort of working with somebody who's making massive changes in their lives. And by massive, sort of from the outside might look quite small while it's happening. So often, we would sort of be celebrating the fact that, say, somebody that's been in prison in and out for the last 12 years has just spent 5 months in the community when the longest they've ever spent is 4 months, but going, this is like, that's a really big shift. Or somebody that has been really kind of chaotic with their ice use is now just sort of managing to get by with just, with less drug use. So, but then the bigger stuff, it all builds on each other. Like if you celebrate those small wins, and this is all of us when we're trying to make changes, whether it's giving up smoking or leaving a terrible relationship, or like usually most of us need someone in our corner to kind of help and be a bit of a cheer squad along the way.
A little bit of support, and quite often it's just one person. If one person supports someone and gives them the confidence, it can make a world of difference, can't it?
Yeah, it absolutely can. And so, I've got to see that a lot. And it'll be things like people having their own place, like getting sort of a successful housing outcome, and somebody actually having a place that they can call home if they may have been homeless for most of their lives. I see some of the
work CRC were doing was also looking after the families of people that have gone in prison. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, and look, I mean, families are...
Because that's something that you tend not to think about. You just think, okay, that person's been punished, but their family's been punished as well. Yeah,
and families often, really feel like they're doing a sentence at the same time as their loved one. They often feel really ashamed and like, not necessarily of their loved ones, but just like they will be judged if they talk to other people about it. They have a lot of grief because it's like losing somebody.
It would be, wouldn't it?
And especially, a lot of parents of people in prison are just desperately worried about their well-being, and partners, and then children of prisoners, of course, are also really doing it tough, missing mum or dad while they're not there. So the work that CRC does, and there's another great organisation called Shine for Kids who does amazing work just with the children of prisoners, but supporting people through that really often that first period when people first go to prison and they don't know what to expect if they haven't been in prison, often supporting families if they're worried about their loved one.
Just on that, and this was from the website for CRC, and little things like things to think about before sentencing. Are you on medication? Like if someone might be, I need this medication, otherwise this is going to happen, but you go into prison, how do you explain that? Like you're caught up in the system. Are you studying? Can you continue to study? Little things like that. And people might, and I'm conscious of it, people might listen to this and go, well, stuff it, they've done the crime and all that. But you made a very valid point that most people come out of prison at some stage. So it's all in all our interests to keep these people pointed in the right direction because they're going to be released back into society.
Yeah, and look, I think a way of thinking about it, and I think that, again, one of the things that, I know that during lockdowns, for instance, people started, feeling really antsy about how little freedom, they had just with say, not being able to...
Did I complain to you?
No, look, we all complained.
It was confronting, wasn't it?
But I guess that often what we don't really realises what loss of liberty actually feels like. And so, we think that, there should be punishment on top of that. But actually, I think we had the tiniest taste. It was nothing like prison, of course, but the tiniest taste of what loss of liberty feels like. You can't see your loved ones. You can't see your family. You can't, You've
got to be home by 9 o'clock.
Yeah. And we all sort of start freaking out. So, if you imagine what loss of liberty actually feels like in a prison situation where there is not, you can't break any of the rules. You can't, it's very hard to escape. I know some people manage to, you've had a couple on your show, but it's very
I still
difficult.
think John got lucky with the helicopter one, but anyway.
But that sort of what that means for us as humans to not be able to move is really it's a really serious punishment. So I guess that what we do on top of that is a whole lot of other kinds of punishment when people are in prison. And I suppose that one of the things that I'm really interested in is why? Because it's certainly not the way that prisons operate in other countries. We don't necessarily have prisons where everybody wears uniforms and has numbers and isn't treated with respect.
You're telling me the prison system in the US is not working?
The US has been a total failure. But actually, even the US has sort of managed to turn things around really significantly. And at least in the US, even, there's lots of work to do. But rhetorically, they've started really recognising both the leadership there that prisons aren't working.
And I think because we're talking from the prisoner's point of view and we're looking at it from one perspective, but there's some good people in corrective services too, isn't there? There's
absolutely.
people, and did you come across that in corrective services? People that genuinely were in there and wanted to make a difference.
Of course, there are people in corrections, there are people in police. Obviously, there are people in there with very good big hearts trying to do a good job within a very complicated system and a historically really, violent system. So there's absolutely people that are making changes, and you find out who those people are when you're working in the space and you rely on them. But I guess that the problem is, and, if one of those people leaves, suddenly you're just left with that system. And so I guess that when we're talking about the need for systems change, we can't just rely on there being one great welfare officer or one great,
an individual can make a small change, but as you said, once they're gone, they're gone.
Yeah, that's right. So we actually need that. In our whole system, we need a whole system full of people that are actually, you'll hear people coming out of prison go, there was a great correctional officer at, this particular prison. But that shouldn't be the exception. That should actually be what prisons are like.
Yeah. There's other stuff from CRC, and it just seems to me it must be a group of people that have got a lot of empathy and care for people. That sort of comes out in what's on their website. But talking about surviving on the inside. So, the type of things that addressing what people's concerns are, what happens when you arrive at reception and what processing at reception. Is that what CRC did too? Help people understand what the process is? Because I know some of the people I've dealt with and sometimes that have fallen foul of the law and that they haven't lived a life of crime, they're terrified and just totally... They don't know what's going to happen. It's what they've seen on a movie might happen. They have no idea. Are we all going to walk in with our tray and blanket and everyone's going to be rattling the cells?
Yeah.
So how did CRC do that?
Often through families are often the people that make contact, and because they're, especially mums and girlfriends and wives, they're the ones that are often doing that sort of work around trying to prepare if somebody hasn't just been taken into remand and they're facing what is likely to be a prison sentence and they've got that opportunity. But also talking to, people will call off, if they think they might be facing a prison sentence and just having somebody that can talk through that. CRC employs a lot of people that are qualified in terms of, they've got sort of community work qualifications, but that have also been to prison themselves. And so that kind of ability to speak to people like caseworkers that not only have the skills to kind of navigate systems and do counselling, but also have experienced what it's like to be in prison.
And that's really good in itself, isn't it? That someone that's been there and is trying to make a difference or trying to bring some good by helping people that, might be going down that same path. Yeah,
it's huge. And I think also, I was thinking about this just recently because, the expertise that comes along from having been in prison and also I think having experienced drug and alcohol addiction is just next level when it comes. I mean, you know, I've done that work for a long time, and I'd sort of be able to tell if you know, things weren't tracking so well for somebody that I was working with. But I was never as onto it as the people that I worked alongside who'd actually been to prison themselves. Like their ability to kind of be sensitive to what was happening in somebody's life, be sensitive to the fronts that people will put on to pretend that everything's okay, their ability to kind of cut through all of that.
Because they can cut through the bullshit.
Exactly, in a way that I wouldn't be able to do. So I think it's amazing for people coming out to be able to see somebody that's a bit further along on that journey. But also as an organisation, you know, it's really useful to have somebody who sort of says, I don't think he's going so well. You know, like I can see, you know, did you look at his eyes? Did you see?
You said you're all right, brother, but I can see you're
exactly.
not that type of thing.
Yeah, so that expertise I think is super useful. But the stuff around that fear of going to prison, but then also like, what do you do if you know that your loved one doesn't have their medication? What do you do if you are worried about their safety or their mental health, which is often the case? Like it's a really, again, it's not a straightforward system. There's no one that you just call up and go, I'm worried about my loved one's health. Like it's not straightforward. So having workers that can kind of help navigate that is pretty useful.
Well, even I see, phone calls, visits, meals, entering the unit for the first time, and one here, do not stare. But that is good advice.
Yeah.
What are you looking at? Nothing. You calling me nothing, and then whack.
Yeah. So do not stare. Stuff around personal space as well. Stuff around, I think there's stuff in there. And I remember, you know, I learned this from people that I worked with that had been to prison. Just stay out of people's faces in the mornings, especially because people have often had a pretty rough night and you don't know where people are at. So give people a bit of space. You know, just really practical stuff about how to kind of not upset people.
Navigate your way through it.
Yeah.
So when people are released from prison, if you had a way of helping them, what's the thing that's missing most to help people when they're released from prison? If money wasn't the option, if we put resources or just whether it's financial or physical resources into it, how could we help people that have got out of prison?
Housing and a worker. Like that's really all it is, a good worker. And, you know, so housing is such an obvious and missing part of the puzzle, and it's so much easier to do all of the other work that needs to happen when you have housing in place. So I know it's a bit boring and people are, you know, but the reality is
people need a home.
10,000 people each year come out of prison in New South Wales and do not have anywhere to live. So if you think about that in terms of, you know, if you're worried about community safety or if you're worried about kind of people not reoffending, giving people somewhere to actually have a base to make the sorts of changes they need to make is really critical. The other thing is, you know, that sort of someone in their corner, that doesn't have to be a worker. That could, you know, some people have like a great girlfriend or a great boyfriend, or, you know, they have a fantastic family that can sort of provide a whole lot of support. But for people that don't, having somebody, and that's usually a worker, it could be a volunteer, that's actually going to be consistently there, consistently sort of supportive and trying to really, again, help people with that really tricky first 3 months, but then beyond that, like, because I guess that what we'd often see is you kind of get all that practical stuff sorted, and then often people want to do some actual work, you know, and often that's when people start talking about their crimes. That's often when people experience great shame or great remorse around what's happened in their lives. Is that because the work is showing them kindness and they're starting to see, well, someone does actually care about me? Is that the type of difference that can make a difference that way? That's what our clients have sort of reflected back when we've done sort of research around what it was about the CRC sort of support. And it's that thing, having someone in my corner, somebody that, you know, believed that I could do it, somebody that I could talk to without judgment. I mean, I remember when I was doing that work the first time, that somebody I was working with went back to prison. He was really struggling, and I went to visit him. He didn't. I sort of found out through someone else that had gone back, and I went to visit him in prison, and he teared up because, you know, and he was so unused to anybody.
Cared enough.
To go in. But again, that's what CRC workers will do regularly, and often that sort of thing of just going, look, you might mess up, and that's okay. We all mess up. We're going to keep working with you and until, you know, you're at a point where you really feel like you've hit your stride and you can do this. But I think housing and somebody to sort of support them and to show them a lot of care and to, I guess, really start understanding who somebody wants to be outside of that environment. Because often, people in prison do lots of courses and anger management and impulsivity and, there's things that people, and probably they're great. But often what's lacking is somebody saying, what do you actually want to do?
What are you going to do?
And who are you going to be outside of
the
this?
The practicalities of creating a life for yourself out there. I know the ones that give me the most joy is ones that I've dealt with, whether I'm the one that's put them in jail or just been associated, where they come out and go, I'm a citizen now, I'm paying taxes, and they're all proud of themselves. And quite often they haven't their whole life. They haven't paid taxes because they've been outlaws or they've been criminals. And I see the joy and the pride in their face, simple little thing go, yeah, I got a job and I'm actually paying taxes. And it's like that's a huge achievement to them. And I think it's to me, it gives an indication they are genuinely trying to step away from that world and make a go of it. But what you're saying there with all the courses and all that, we still need that practical, okay, you're going to come out, what are you going to do? You got to make a living.
Yeah, and actually planning for that, because I think that's the other thing, like people sort of worry about it but don't necessarily get a lot of help in kind of actually thinking through what some of those options might be. And, and there is stuff around criminal records that can make it tricky to get employment. And there's also people that...
Are you finding employers are willing to take the risk and hire people that have been inside? Is that...
There are definitely some amazing sort of organisations and employers that will do it. And I think it's one of the things in Australia we haven't really done that well in terms of, we've sort of in the United States, there's been a lot of movement and action around giving people a second chance. Donald Trump was sort of, he was actually kind of really behind that idea that, a criminal record shouldn't prohibit you from engaging in getting a job. In Australia, there's not been a lot of, I guess, movement around that, and people still really struggle and they still have to disclose and often get discriminated against.
I think it's a little bit because of the lack of understanding. What we're talking about earlier, people don't understand what goes inside the prison and just they're a pack of animals. They're locked up from society because they need to, and I suppose that ignorance would scare people. Yeah,
exactly. So I think that kind of... Again, when people sit down and actually have a chat with people in a context that's not, say, I often think, not a police environment or not necessarily, when things are chaotic, you learn about people in this completely different way. And I often think about, I guess that the people that you were locking up, your impression of who they were would have been very different probably to the impression that I would have formed sort of, at the end of their sentence, because people, we're all different in different circumstances. So who people are when they're kind of, I guess, running from the law and, and in living in chaos, and then who people are at the end of their prison sentence, and when you're sort of saying, hey, how can I help you? You're going to see a very different side to somebody.
And I know in our conversations you said, because a lot of people saying we make the difference when they're kids, and I 100% agree with that, but I think you made the point to me that well, it's not just kids. Like, people can change, adults can change. Even, and I that made me reflect and think, you're right. Like, we've got to give people a chance any stage in their life. Everyone's entitled to some redemption and turn their life around.
Yeah, and I think that it's sometimes, like, I understand why, and I hear it a lot even amongst other advocates, by the time they've got to prison, it's too late. And I really don't agree, mostly because I've seen such significant changes, men in their late 40s that have spent literally their whole lives.
Sometimes they just get too old for it and they don't need the stress. I've had their career criminals say, mate, I'm too old for this anymore. I don't want to do it, because it is a stressful life.
And their bodies pack it in as well. People physically can't run anymore. They can't run. And it is exhausting and living on, that sort of adrenaline. So there's a lot of research about people kind of aging out of crime. But I guess that, that's fine. That's a good kind of, we at CRC, we worked with a lot of men in their 40s. And
what about women in crime too? And one of our recent guests, it sort of dawned on me that when I talk prisoners, I'm thinking men all the time. But it's increasing the female population in prisons too. So they play a part on it, but they're almost the unseen prisoners.
Yeah, and it's
what's your thoughts on? Do they have difficulties from a different perspectives than the men do?
Yeah, I think that there's a whole lot of things that happen for women who are incarcerated that are a bit different for men, and it's a small proportion of the population. So that it means that the gender sort of specific needs often aren't really met. I think there's been some recognition in recent years of that, done some good work and good programs that are focused on women in prison. But for the key thing when working with women coming out of prison or women that are in prison is often around kids and their kids. A lot of the men that we would work with in prison would have loved ones on the outside, often who were women, so that partners perhaps that were keeping things ticking over in terms of their kids or mums that were sort of in there. A lot of the women that I would work with didn't really have anybody on the outside sort of say to look after the kids, so there were often the separation from kids would really constitute by far the hardest sort of punishment out of everything.
And you mentioned earlier the difficulty getting their kids back once they've been released from prison.
Yeah.
Because whoever's been looking after them mightn't want to hand them back.
But also just the sort of the process of kind of custody restoration if they've been in the care of the state, which is often what happens, is really arduous. Like it's not an easy thing. So, and also, one of the most heartbreaking things I think that I've been sort of witness to and that other workers that work with women are witness to is that children can be removed because of historical reasons. Mm-hmm. So even if somebody is actually doing really well, they've got out of prison, they're no longer using drugs and alcohol, they're out of their violent relationship, which is another defining feature of the experience of many women that end up in prison, is that they've been in situations of often extreme domestic violence. So, women will have left their relationship, they've stopped using drugs, they've, done all of the courses that they're supposed to do. Yeah. They may even have somewhere to live. We've had women in those situations who have become pregnant and had their newborns removed on the basis of historical child protection matters.
That's hard to fathom, isn't it?
And that's,
especially if they've worked so hard to turn their life around, and that would send them spiraling.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's sort of those kinds of structures and systems that make making a break from your past almost impossible. I mean, people, again, it's remarkable because women do it and women keep fighting and women keep sort of, working to get custody. But it's absolutely sort of heartbreaking. The experience that women have, I think also, most people in prison, and again, this is not to excuse crime that is committed. It's just a reality of the experience of the vast majority of people that go to prison. Yeah. But most people that go to prison have experienced some sort of trauma. And for a lot of women, that's in the form of some sort of gendered violence, so either as children or as adults.
Yep.
And there's research that puts that as high as 90% of women in custody that have experienced that sort of trauma. So I think that when we're kind of looking at, well, how do we both support the women that are in there, but also, not also recognise the harm that crime creates? I think, when we start trying to put together what that puzzle might look like, we need to sort of start really thinking about this idea that offenders and victims sort of exist in opposition, because I think that you can see in most of the prisoner population, but especially in the women's population, that even though women in prison have offended or committed crime, they're also, almost all of them are victims of quite serious crime.
That's a different or interesting way of looking at it. It's not clear cut. You can't separate them, can you? We're talking women, but then I'm talking about I'm thinking about some of the blokes that they were victims of sexual abuse at different stages in the boys' homes and that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, when if you look at the Royal Commission and into institutional responses to abuse, there were, I think, 800 interviews that were conducted with people in prison. And that's just people that, put up their hand and agreed to have those conversations. So that And that's a really tricky thing, I think, for all of us to get our heads around, because we're very used to thinking of people in prison as being the baddies and people in the community as being...
you've just taken us into an area that makes us... so it's not black and white. It's,
So again, it's my grandma saying, some of the Nazis, they were not so bad, really. Like, it's sort of... It's this thing where you're like, it's not actually just a matter of... Like, I think we tend to think about victims' rights and offenders' rights as being somehow in opposition. So if, if I don't know, prisons are seen as too soft, it's like that's a slap in the face for victims. And I can really understand why, why we would kind of have that mentality. But also, I think when you do, again, just look at the reality of who it is that is in prison and what their life experience has been. And you do start understanding that most people in prison have themselves also been the victim of crime, but not necessarily the sort of crime that we've read about on, it's often something that's happened when they've been a kid and nobody's talked about it.
Nobody would be game enough to talk about it back then, and now they're starting to talk about it.
Exactly.
Well, look, I think you're opening my mind up to a lot of different things. It's been a fascinating chat. We'll have a break here, a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the work that you're doing now with the Restorative Justice Initiative, and get your views on prisons and how they could be improved, or how we could improve the whole criminal justice system. So really enjoying the chat. It's just a completely different perspective, and we'll be back soon.
Excellent. Thanks,
Cheers.
Gary.